She fled after one night with the billionaire CEO. He found her years later raising his secret quadruplets. Stop everything you're doing right now. A billionaire CEO just walked into a small cafe and discovered he's the father of quadruplets he never knew existed. The woman who's been hiding his children for 4 years is about to have her entire world exposed in front of 20 strangers drinking coffee. Those are my children. No, they're not. Gabrielle, they have my eyes. All 4 of them. The silence in that cafe was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 4 little kids staring up at a man they'd never met. 20 customers with their phones out, recording everything. And one woman whose biggest secret just got blown wide open. But here's the insane part. This billionaire. He's been secretly paying for everything in her life for 4 years. Her cafe, her sister's medical bills, even her rent. He's been protecting the woman who ran away from him while she raised his children in hiding. You think you know how this story ends? You don't. Because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about love, lies, and the price of pride. This story is about to get so intense that you won't be able to look away. So grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, and prepare for a roller coaster that starts with one magical night and ends with a confrontation that will leave you speechless. Ready? Because this story begins 4 years ago with a decision that changed everything. The Fairmont San Francisco glittered like 1,000 diamonds against the October sky. Inside the grand ballroom, Silicon Valley's elite were gathered for the annual Tech Philanthropists Gala. This wasn't just any party. This was where billion-dollar deals were made over champagne, where the future of technology was decided between the main course and dessert. But Gabrielle Moreau wasn't supposed to be mingling with tech moguls and venture capitalists. She was there to work. Her small chocolate cafe had been hired to provide specialty desserts for the evening, and she was standing next to her display of handcrafted truffles, watching wealthy strangers sample her creations like they were examining fine art. The emerald silk dress she wore didn't belong to her. She'd borrowed it from her roommate because she couldn't afford anything appropriate for an event where a single glass of champagne probably cost more than her weekly groceries. Every time she caught her reflection in the ballroom's mirrors, she felt like a fraud. These are incredible, a woman in diamonds said, biting into one of Gabrielle's lavender honey truffles. Who made them? I did, Gabrielle replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. You're very talented. This flavor combination is extraordinary. But as quickly as the compliment came, the woman moved on, probably forgetting Gabrielle existed before she'd even turned away. This was how it always went. She created beautiful things for people who had everything, then watched them enjoy her work before disappearing back into their world of privilege she'd never be part of. Gabrielle was arranging the display when she heard a voice behind her that made her heart skip. Excuse me, are you the artist behind these incredible desserts? She turned around and felt the air leave her lungs. The man standing before her was devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair. Dark hair with silver at the temples, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, and emerald green eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. His suit probably cost more than 6 months of her rent, but there was something in his expression that made her think he'd be just as compelling in jeans and a t-shirt. Artist might be generous, Gabrielle managed. I'm just a chocolatier who got carried away. He smiled, and the expression completely transformed his face from intimidating to warmly approachable. Raphael Thorne. And trust me, what you've created here is definitely art. This lavender honey truffle is extraordinary. Gabrielle's eyes widened. She knew that name. Raphael Thorne was one of the most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. His company, Thorne Ventures, had funded some of the biggest tech startups of the decade. What was he doing talking to her about chocolate? Gabrielle Moreau, she said, shaking his extended hand. His grip was firm, confident, but she noticed calluses that seemed at odds with his polished appearance. And thank you. That recipe took me months to perfect. Months well spent. I've eaten in Michelin-starred restaurants across 3 continents, and I've never tasted anything quite like this. His eyes held genuine appreciation, not the polite small talk she was used to. Tell me, what inspired this flavor combination? The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked about her inspiration. Food critics dismissed her cafe as charmingly amateur. Investors turned down her expansion proposals without trying her products. Even her ex-boyfriend had called her passion for chocolate a cute hobby that she'd eventually outgrow. I grew up in Provence, Gabrielle found herself saying. My grandmother had this incredible garden where lavender grew wild alongside her beehives. She'd make these honey cakes that tasted like summer afternoons and childhood dreams. When I smelled that combination, I'm 8 years old again, helping her in the kitchen and believing anything was possible. Raphael's expression softened in a way that made her chest tight. That's exactly what I tasted when I bit into this. Possibility and childhood wonder. You've managed to capture memories in chocolate. The sincerity in his voice did something dangerous to her equilibrium. Here was one of the most successful men in Silicon Valley, someone whose investment decisions could make or break entire companies, and he was talking to her about memories and wonder like they were the most important things in the world. What about you? Gabrielle asked, surprising herself with her boldness. What brought you into venture capital? You don't strike me as someone who always dreamed of funding startups. His laugh held a note of irony. You're very perceptive. Would you believe me if I said it wasn't my choice originally? Try me. My father built Thorn Ventures from absolutely nothing. He started with $1,000 and a dream, and by the time I was born, he'd turned it into an empire. He had very specific ideas about legacy and succession. Raphael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I wanted to be an architect, actually. Spent 4 years at Stanford studying structural engineering and design, dreaming of creating buildings that would make people happy to be inside them. What changed your mind? My father died suddenly when I was 25. Massive heart attack. Thorn Ventures was his life's work, his baby, and suddenly it was mine to inherit or watch crumble. He took a sip of champagne, his eyes distant with memory. Turns out I had a natural gift for recognizing potential in people and ideas. Even if it wasn't the path I'd chosen for myself. Gabrielle could hear the regret beneath his words. Do you ever think about what you'd have built? If you'd become an architect? Every single day, he admitted without hesitation. I'd have designed houses that felt like homes instead of showcases. Buildings that served human needs rather than just looking impressive in magazines. Spaces that made people feel safe and welcome and genuinely happy. That sounds beautiful. What about you? Was chocolate always the dream, or did you have other plans? Gabrielle laughed, though it carried its own note of sadness. I was going to be a doctor, actually. Pre-med at Berkeley, full scholarship based on my grades and what the admissions committee called my compelling personal story about being the daughter of French immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for my education. What happened? Life happened. The simple word carried years of disappointment and sacrifice. My younger sister, Celeste, was born with a rare genetic condition called Prader-Willi syndrome. The medical bills were astronomical, even with insurance. Physical therapy, special education, constant monitoring. My parents couldn't afford to keep paying for my education and her treatments at the same time. I dropped out after 2 years. Raphael's eyes filled with genuine sympathy. That must have been devastating. Giving up your dream to help your family. It was. But in a strange way, it led me to chocolate. I needed a job that would let me help with Celeste's care, something flexible that paid decent money. I started working at this tiny patisserie in the Mission District. The owner, Henri, was this wonderful French man who taught me that creating something beautiful could heal people in different ways than medicine ever could. He used to say that chocolate was therapy you could taste. And he was right. Completely right. When I watch someone bite into a truffle I've made and see their entire face light up, when I see a couple share one of my desserts on their anniversary, when someone tells me that my hot chocolate got them through the worst day of their life, that's healing too. Different from medicine, but absolutely real. If you've ever made a life-changing decision based on love for someone else, hit that like button right now. Because Gabrielle's choice to sacrifice her dreams for her sister is about to lead her somewhere she never could have imagined. They'd moved away from the dessert station without Gabrielle even noticing, finding themselves in a quieter alcove where the noise of the gala felt distant and muted. The space felt intimate, like they were the only two people in a room full of hundreds. "Can I tell you something?" Raphael said, his voice lower now, more personal. "I've attended dozens of these events over the years. They're usually just elaborate networking exercises disguised as charity work. Everyone's working an angle, making deals, positioning themselves for the next big opportunity. But this conversation, talking to you, is the first time in months that I've felt genuinely engaged with another human being." Heat bloomed in Gabrielle's chest. "I know exactly what you mean. I don't usually attend events like this. This isn't really my world at all. Maybe it should be." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger that made her pulse quicken. Gabrielle knew she should step back, should thank him for the lovely conversation and return to her professional obligations. This man lived in a realm of private jets and board meetings and decisions that affected thousands of lives. She lived paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment above her cafe, spending her evenings caring for her sister and her days trying to build something sustainable from sugar, cocoa, and sheer determination. But when Raphael looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met, when he listened to her stories like they actually mattered, she felt herself becoming someone braver than she'd ever been in her entire life. "Would you like to get some fresh air?" he asked. "The hotel has this beautiful terrace that overlooks the bay. It's one of my favorite spots in the city." Every rational thought in her head told her to politely decline. To finish her work, go home to her small apartment, and forget this conversation ever happened. But her heart was telling her something completely different. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. The Fairmont's terrace was breathtaking. The October night was cool but not cold, and the view of San Francisco Bay stretched out before them like a carpet of lights reflected on dark water. The sounds of the city drifted up from below, but they felt removed from all of it, suspended between earth and sky in their own private world. "It's incredible," Gabrielle said, moving to the railing and breathing in the salt-tinged air. "It really is." But when she glanced back, Raphael was looking at her, not the view. The attraction between them was undeniable, electric in a way that made the space around them feel charged with potential energy. But beneath the obvious chemistry was something deeper, more profound. Recognition, as though they'd both been searching their entire lives for someone who understood the specific shape of their dreams and disappointments. "This is completely crazy," Gabrielle whispered. "Absolutely insane," Raphael agreed, stepping closer until she could smell his cologne, something warm and woodsy that made her want to lean into him. "I should go back inside. People will notice you're gone. Important people who probably need your attention more than I do. Let them notice. Let them wait." He reached up to trace her cheek with gentle fingers that sent shivers down her spine. "Gabrielle, I know this is sudden. I know we literally just met a few hours ago. But I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to have this conversation with you." She leaned into his touch, every defense she'd ever built around her heart crumbling under the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "I feel it too. And it terrifies me more than I can possibly express." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I can't afford to want something I can't have. Because I've learned not to reach for things that are out of my league." Raphael's thumb traced across her lower lip with exquisite gentleness. "Who says you can't have this? Who gets to decide what you deserve?" When he kissed her, it was soft at first, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But when she kissed him back instead, melting into him like she'd been made for this exact moment, The kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff at the same time. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories and secrets with the honesty of people who might never see each other again but wanted to make every moment count. When the gala officially ended and the last guests began filtering out, Raphael looked at her with an expression that made her heart race. "I don't want tonight to end," he said simply. "Come back to my place. Not for anything you're not comfortable with, just to keep talking. I feel like I could talk to you for the rest of my life and never run out of things to discover." Gabrielle stood beside his car, a sleek black Tesla that probably cost more than her annual income, and felt herself standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. "I don't usually do things like this," she said honestly. "Neither do I," Raphael replied. "But everything about tonight has been different. Everything about you is different." His penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the entire city sprawling below them like a circuit board made of light and possibility. The space was elegant but warm, clearly designed by someone who understood that true luxury should feel inviting rather than intimidating. "I design all my own spaces," Raphael explained when he noticed her taking in the details. "It's the closest I get to architecture these days. Every room in this place was planned to make people feel comfortable and welcome." They opened a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Gabrielle's monthly grocery budget and continued the conversation that had started at the gala. Raphael showed her his private study, lined with architectural books and sketches of buildings he'd never had the chance to create. Gabrielle shared photos of her sister, explaining Celeste's condition and her dreams of eventually expanding the cafe to employ people with disabilities. "You're absolutely remarkable," Raphael said, studying a photograph of Gabrielle and Celeste baking together, both of them covered in flour and laughing. "The way you care for her, the way you've built something beautiful from such difficult circumstances. Most people would have been crushed by what you've been through. I just do what needs to be done. There's nothing remarkable about taking care of the people you love. No, you do so much more than that." His voice was intense with conviction. "You create joy for people every single day. You see possibilities where other people only see limitations. You turn chocolate into medicine for the soul, and you've never once acted like your sacrifices make you special. That kind of strength and humility is incredibly rare. No one had ever seen her that way before." The recognition in his eyes was intoxicating, dangerous in its intensity, and absolutely addictive. When they made love that night, it was with a connection that transcended anything purely physical. They moved together like they'd been waiting their entire lives to find each other, every touch a revelation, every whispered word a promise that neither of them was ready to voice but both of them felt in their bones. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, Raphael tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder while the city glittered below them. "Stay," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with contentment and something deeper. "Don't disappear when morning comes. I want to wake up with you here." "I'm not going anywhere," Gabrielle promised, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "This is exactly where I want to be." But the universe had other plans entirely. Gabrielle woke to her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The room was flooded with golden morning light, and Raphael was gone. She could hear the shower running in the adjoining bathroom, could hear him humming something soft and off-key that made her smile. Then she saw her phone display. 17 missed calls from her mother. Dread flooded her system like ice water in her veins. Her mother never called this early unless something was catastrophically wrong. She answered the 18th call with shaking fingers. "Gabrielle, thank God." Her mother's voice was thick with tears and panic. "It's Celeste. We're at UCSF Medical Center. You need to come right now. Please, you need to come right now." "What happened? Is she okay? Mom, what's going on?" The words that followed felt like physical blows to her chest. Celeste had collapsed during the night. The doctors suspected serious complications from her condition, something that required immediate experimental surgery. Surgery that wasn't covered by any insurance plan. Surgery that cost $180,000 and had to be performed within the next 48 hours, or they might lose her forever. Gabrielle sat on the edge of Raphael's bed, her sister's life hanging in the balance while she was in a billionaire's penthouse, pretending she belonged in his world of privilege and possibility. "I'm coming," she managed through a throat that felt like it was closing. "Tell her I'm on my way. Tell her I love her." She was pulling on her dress with fumbling fingers when Raphael emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, his dark hair still damp. His smile of greeting faded instantly when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "Gabrielle, what happened?" "I have to go. Family emergency." The words came out sharp, defensive, like armor she was throwing up between them. "My sister is in the hospital." "Okay. Let me get dressed and I'll drive you there. Whatever's happening, whatever you need." "No." The word exploded out of her harder than she'd intended. "This isn't your problem. You don't need to get involved in this." Confusion flickered across his features. "Gabrielle, talk to me. What's happening with your sister? How can I help?" But she couldn't tell him. Couldn't explain that her 16-year-old sister needed surgery that cost more than most people's houses. Couldn't admit that her family was about to lose everything, that she was standing in his penthouse in last night's dress feeling exactly like Cinderella after midnight, suddenly painfully aware of the vast chasm between their worlds. If she told him about the money, he'd offer to pay without thinking twice about it. A man like Raphael Thorne probably had $180,000 sitting in his checking account earning interest. He could solve her family's crisis with a single phone call, and then what would that make her? The charity case. The struggling chocolatier he'd rescued. Every moment between them would be forever tainted by the knowledge that she'd needed him to save her. She'd go from being his equal to being his responsibility, his good deed, his pet project. "I have to handle this alone," she said, grabbing her purse and heading for the door with desperate urgency. "Gabrielle, wait." Raphael caught her arm gently, his touch sending electricity up her spine even in her panic. "Whatever this is, whatever's happening, we can face it together. That's what last night meant to me. That we found something real worth fighting for." The sincerity in his voice almost shattered her resolve completely. But accepting his help would fundamentally change everything between them. She'd go from being a partner in whatever they were building to being someone he'd rescued, someone who owed him everything. "I'll call you," she said, meaning it desperately in that moment. "I promise I'll call you as soon as I can." But as she stood in the hospital waiting room 6 hours later, watching her parents' faces crumble as they tried to figure out how to find $180,000 in 48 hours, calling Raphael became impossible. How could she reach out to someone she'd spent exactly one night with and ask him to save her family? How could she start what might be the most important relationship of her life by immediately becoming a burden he'd have to carry? The surgery was scheduled for the following evening. Gabrielle spent the next day liquidating absolutely everything she owned that had any value whatsoever. Her cafe's backup equipment, her car, her grandmother's jewelry, even her laptop. It raised $23,000. Her parents took out a second mortgage on their house for another $40,000. Still nowhere near enough. That night, sitting beside Celeste's hospital bed and watching her sister sleep fitfully while machines monitored her failing systems, Gabrielle made the hardest decision of her entire life. She deleted Raphael's number from her phone and began planning her complete disappearance from the life he'd known. 2 days later, after surgery that was successfully funded by an anonymous donor who turned out to be Henri, her former mentor who'd mortgaged his own restaurant to help save Celeste, Gabrielle discovered something that changed her world forever. She was pregnant. The clinic was sterile and bright, and the test results were unmistakable. 2 pink lines that meant everything had just gotten infinitely more complicated. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. The ultrasound revealed something that made the technician call for a second opinion, then a third. "Are you sure about your dates?" the doctor asked, studying the screen with intense concentration. Positive. Why? Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong. But you're not carrying one baby. The doctor's smile was gentle but stunned. You're carrying 4 quadruplets. 4 healthy heartbeats. Gabrielle stared at the grainy black and white images on the screen, at 4 tiny forms that would grow into 4 individual human beings who would need everything she couldn't possibly provide. 4 children. 4 lives that would depend entirely on her. 4 reasons why disappearing from Raphael's world wasn't just the right choice anymore, it was the only choice. Sitting in that clinic, staring at proof that her one perfect night had created 4 new lives, Gabrielle made a decision that would define the next 4 years of her existence. She was going to disappear completely. Change her name, move to a different city, start over where Raphael Thorne could never find her. She would raise his children alone rather than burden him with a family he'd never planned for and responsibilities he'd never asked for. 3 weeks later, Gabrielle Moreau legally became Gabrielle Burke. She moved to Portland, Oregon, and used the last of her savings to open a tiny chocolate cafe called Sweet Solace. She never looked back, and she never stopped thinking about the man whose children were growing inside her. But what Gabrielle didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Raphael Thorne had never stopped looking for her. And in 4 years, their paths were destined to cross again in the most unexpected way possible. The truth was about to surface, and when it did, both of their carefully constructed worlds would never be the same again. 4 years. That's how long Gabrielle Burke had been living a completely different life in Portland, Oregon, raising 4 children who grew more like their father every single day. The tiny cafe she'd opened, Sweet Solace, had become her sanctuary and her lifeline. Every morning at 5 a.m., she'd unlock the door and begin preparing the handcrafted chocolates and pastries that had slowly built a loyal following in the cozy neighborhood where she'd made her home. But running a cafe while raising quadruplets was like trying to juggle fire while riding a unicycle. There were days when Gabrielle wondered how she was still standing, how she hadn't completely fallen apart under the weight of it all. The children were as different as 4 humans could possibly be, each one a unique combination of herself and the man they'd never met. Julian was the quiet observer, with Raphael's exact emerald eyes and an intensity that sometimes took Gabrielle's breath away. At 4 years old, he could sit for hours building elaborate structures with blocks, his little face scrunched in concentration that reminded her painfully of his father examining architectural plans. "Mama, why do buildings need to be strong?" he'd asked just last week, holding up a tower he'd constructed. "So they can protect the people inside," Gabrielle had answered, her throat tight with emotion. "Like you protect us." "Exactly like that, sweetheart." Celeste, named for her aunt who was now thriving thanks to that anonymous donation, was pure fire and determination. She approached life with the same fierce intensity that had gotten Gabrielle through her darkest moments. When Celeste wanted something, she didn't just ask for it, she presented a logical argument for why she deserved it. "Mama, I think we should get a puppy," she'd announced over breakfast 2 days ago. "Oh really? And why's that?" "Because puppies teach responsibility, and I'm very responsible. Also, Leo would stop crying so much if he had a dog to play with. The kid was going to be a lawyer or a CEO someday. Maybe both." Leo was their entertainer, the one who could make anyone laugh even on the worst days. He had Gabrielle's warm brown eyes but Raphael's natural charisma, that indefinable quality that made people want to be around him. At preschool, he was everyone's favorite, the kid who included the shy ones and made sure nobody felt left out. And then there was Sophia, their baby, though at 4 she'd definitely object to being called that. Sophia was wise beyond her years, with hazel eyes that seemed to see straight into people's souls. She was the peacemaker, the one who somehow always knew exactly what to say when her siblings were fighting. Watching the 4 of them together, Gabrielle often felt like she was looking at a complete family unit that was missing just one crucial piece. The piece that walked through her cafe door on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 4 years after the night that changed everything. But let's back up a little, because there's something you need to understand about those 4 years. Something that will make what happens next even more incredible. Gabrielle thought she'd been surviving on her own all this time. She thought her success with Sweet Solace was due to her hard work, determination, and the gradual building of a customer base who appreciated her artisanal chocolates and warm atmosphere. She had no idea that every major break she'd gotten, every stroke of good fortune that had kept her and the children afloat, had been orchestrated by the man she'd run away from. The investor who'd bought her building and offered her a 5-year lease at below market rent. That was Raphael, working through shell companies. The grant she'd received to hire employees with disabilities, allowing her to expand the cafe's mission. Raphael had funded that program specifically for her. The anonymous corporate orders that always seemed to come through during her slowest months, keeping the business profitable. Every single one had been arranged by Thorn Ventures. Even her sister Celeste's ongoing medical care, the experimental treatments that had given her a completely normal life, were being paid for by a foundation that Raphael had created and funded entirely out of his own pocket. For 4 years, he'd been her guardian angel from a distance, protecting her and their children while she believed she was doing it all alone. Meanwhile, Raphael Thorn was living his own version of hell. The morning after Gabrielle disappeared, he'd gone to her cafe in the Mission District, only to find it closed with a "family emergency" sign in the window. He'd tried calling, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He'd waited outside her apartment building for hours, but she never came home. That's when the real search began. "I need you to find someone," he told his head of security that same afternoon, sliding a photo across his desk. It was a picture he'd taken of Gabrielle at the gala, laughing at something he'd said, her face radiant with joy. "Missing person case?" Marcus had asked. "Not missing. Disappeared. There's a difference." For months, Raphael had thrown every resource at his disposal into finding Gabrielle Moreau. Private investigators, digital forensics experts, even contact with every hospital in the Bay Area to make sure nothing terrible had happened to her. It was Henri from the patisserie who finally gave him the first real clue. "She came to me 3 days after you met," the elderly Frenchman had explained when Raphael tracked him down. "Desperate for money, crying about her sister needing surgery. I gave her what I could, but it wasn't enough." How much did she need? $180,000. Raphael had written the check that same day, anonymously, through a medical foundation he'd established within hours of learning about Celeste's condition. But Gabrielle had already vanished by then. Legal name change, new city, complete reinvention of her entire identity. It took Raphael's investigators 2 years to track down Gabrielle Burke in Portland. When they finally located Sweet Solace, Raphael made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He didn't go to her immediately. Instead, he watched from a distance. "Why aren't you contacting her?" Marcus had asked. "We know where she is, we know she's safe. Why not just go to Portland?" "Because she ran away from me once," Raphael had said quietly, staring at surveillance photos of Gabrielle carrying groceries into the cafe, looking tired but content. "She must have had a reason. Until I understand what that reason was, I'm not going to force myself back into her life." But he also wasn't going to let her struggle. Within a month of finding her, Raphael had quietly purchased the building that housed Sweet Solace through a shell corporation. He'd restructured her lease to make it affordable, then began the subtle process of ensuring her business thrived. Corporate catering orders that came through a network of his business contacts. A grant program for small businesses employing disabled workers that he'd created specifically to help her expand. Even customers, executives from companies in his portfolio who just happened to develop a taste for artisanal chocolates and recommended Sweet Solace to their friends. Raphael had become the invisible hand guiding Gabrielle's success, protecting her from a distance while he tried to figure out why she'd left and whether he'd ever have the courage to approach her again. Then, 3 months ago, everything changed. He'd been reviewing the quarterly reports from Sweet Solace, a routine check to make sure the business was staying profitable, when he'd noticed something in the insurance filings that made his blood stop cold. Gabrielle Burke was listed as the guardian of 4 children. Quadruplets. Born exactly 9 months after their night together. Julian Burke. Celeste Burke. Leo Burke. Sophia Burke. For names that represented 4 lives he'd never known existed. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd been protecting a woman who disappeared after one night together, thinking she'd simply decided he wasn't worth the trouble of a phone call. But she hadn't just left him. She'd left him while carrying his children. For the past 3 months, Raphael had been conducting his own private surveillance of Sweet Solace, not through investigators this time, but personally. He'd sat in coffee shops across the street, watching Gabrielle arrive every morning with 4 children in tow, watching her juggle motherhood and business ownership with a grace that left him breathless. He'd seen his son Julian's serious concentration as he colored at a corner table while Gabrielle worked. He'd watched his daughter Celeste's animated storytelling during their afternoon snack time. He'd observed Leo's infectious laughter that made other customers smile just by hearing it. He'd witnessed little Sophia's gentle way of comforting her siblings when they were upset. And he'd fallen in love with all 4 of them from a distance, these children who were half him and half the woman he'd never stopped thinking about. The hardest part had been watching Gabrielle herself. She was different than she'd been 4 years ago, stronger but also more tired. There was a steel in her spine now that spoke of battles fought and won, of a woman who'd been forged by motherhood into something unbreakable. But there were also moments when she thought no one was looking, moments when her guard dropped and he could see the exhaustion, the loneliness, the weight of carrying everything alone. More than once, he'd almost walked across the street and into Sweet Solace. More than once, he'd started his car and driven halfway to Portland before turning around, paralyzed by the fear that she'd run away again if she saw him coming. Until this morning, when he'd finally decided that enough was enough. For years of wondering. For years of protecting her from the shadows. For years of not knowing his own children. Comment below if you think Raphael should have approached her sooner, or if he was right to wait. Because what happens next is about to change everything for both of them. The bell above the door of Sweet Solace chimed with such violence that every patron in the cozy chocolate cafe turned to stare. Raphael Thorne stood in the doorway, his 6'4" frame filling the entrance like a storm cloud blocking out the Portland morning sun. His emerald eyes swept the space until they locked onto one person behind the glass display case filled with handcrafted truffles and delicate pastries. Gabrielle felt her world tilt on its axis. The ceramic mug she'd been cleaning slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble counter in a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo through her chest. "We need to talk," his voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversations and the soft jazz playing overhead. "Now." 20 customers stopped mid-conversation. The barista at the espresso machine paused with the steam wand in her hand. Even the background music seemed to quiet as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Gabrielle's hands were shaking as she stared at the man she hadn't seen in 4 years, the man whose children were currently at preschool just 6 blocks away, completely unaware that their father had finally found them. "Raphael," she whispered, his name feeling foreign on her lips after so long. "For years, Gabrielle." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the emotion underneath, carefully contained but threatening to explode. "For years you've been running this place. For years you've been raising children. For years I've been wondering if you were alive or dead." The customers were starting to realize they were witnessing something intensely personal. Phones were coming out, recording everything. This was exactly the kind of public disaster Gabrielle had been trying to avoid her entire life. "Can we please not do this here?" she said quietly, gesturing around the cafe full of witnesses. "No. We're doing this here, right now. Because I've been patient long enough." Raphael stepped closer to the counter, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know about the children, Gabrielle. I know about Julian and Celeste and Leo and Sophia. I know they're mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Someone's coffee cup clattered to the floor. A woman near the window gasped audibly. I don't know what you're talking about, Gabrielle said, but her voice was shaking and they both knew it was a lie. Really? You're going to stand there and pretend that 4 children who look exactly like me, born exactly 9 months after we spent the night together, are just a coincidence? Gabrielle's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her in the most public way possible. Everything she'd built, every wall she'd put up to protect herself and the children, was falling apart in front of 20 strangers with their phones recording her worst nightmare coming true. Raphael, please. Please what? Please let you keep lying to me for another 4 years. Please pretend I don't have a right to know my own children. His control was slipping now, 4 years of suppressed pain and anger finally breaking through. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? Do you know what it's like to search for someone for months, thinking they might be dead, only to find out they've been raising your children in secret? You don't understand. Then explain it to me. Explain why you disappeared without a word. Explain why you've been raising my children alone when I could have been there for all of you. Explain why you thought I didn't deserve to know they existed. Tears were streaming down Gabrielle's face now, 4 years of guilt and fear and desperate love for her children finally overwhelming her. Because I couldn't ask you to save me, she whispered. Because I couldn't start a relationship by being your charity case. Because I loved you too much to burden you with my problems. Raphael stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Burden me? Charity case? His voice was rough with disbelief. Gabrielle, do you know what I've been doing for the past 4 years? She shook her head, confusion replacing some of the panic in her eyes. I've been funding your sister's medical treatments through an anonymous foundation. I've been the investor who bought this building and gave you a below-market lease. I've been arranging the corporate orders that kept this place profitable during slow months. I've been the grant program that let you hire disabled employees. For 4 years, I've been taking care of you and our children from the shadows while you raised them thinking you were doing it all alone. The revelation hit Gabrielle like a physical blow. Everything she'd accomplished, every success she'd attributed to her own hard work and determination, had been guided by his invisible hand. That's impossible, she breathed. Is it? Is it impossible that I'd move heaven and earth to protect the woman I fell in love with in one night? Is it impossible that I'd spend 4 years making sure you and our children never wanted for anything, even though you disappeared from my life? Our children. The voice came from behind Raphael, small and curious. Everyone turned to see 4 small faces peering around the cafe door. Preschool had ended early for teacher conferences, and Julian, Celeste, Leo, and Sophia had walked the 6 blocks to Sweet Solace like they did every Tuesday. 4 children with unmistakably familiar features stared up at the tall stranger who was making their mother cry. Mama, Leo said, always the protector despite being only 4 years old, why is the tall man making you sad? Raphael turned around slowly, and the moment he laid eyes on his children for the first time, his knees nearly gave out. Julian, serious and contemplative, with his exact emerald eyes studying this stranger with scientific precision. Celeste, fierce and determined, positioning herself protectively in front of her siblings like a tiny general. Leo, warm and charismatic, his brown eyes so much like Gabrielle's but with that unmistakable spark of mischief that reminded Raphael of his own childhood. And little Sophia, wise beyond her years, looking between her mother and this stranger with an understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young. Hello, Raphael said softly, dropping to his knees to bring himself to their eye level. His voice was thick with emotion as he looked at the 4 people he'd been unknowingly loving from a distance for months. Are you the reason Mama's crying? Celeste demanded, crossing her tiny arms in a gesture that was so reminiscent of Gabrielle it made his chest ache. I hope not, Raphael said gently. I'm actually here because I want to meet you. All of you. Sophia stepped forward, studying his face with those serious hazel eyes. You have the same eyes as Julian, she observed matter-of-factly. I do, Raphael agreed, his voice barely steady. Are you our daddy? The question came from Leo, direct and innocent and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. The entire cafe went dead silent. Gabrielle was frozen behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. 20 strangers held their breath, witnessing the most private moment of their lives. Raphael looked at his son, this brave, sweet boy who'd just asked the question that would change everything, and felt his heart break open in the best possible way. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm your father. And I've been looking for you for a very long time." What happened next was something that would be talked about in that Portland neighborhood for years to come. Sophia, without hesitation, walked straight into Raphael's arms. Leo followed immediately, his natural trust overriding any caution. Celeste held back for a moment, still protective, but when she saw her siblings accepting this stranger, she stepped forward too. Only Julian remained apart, studying the scene with those serious eyes that were so much like his father's. "Where have you been?" he asked quietly. "Mama said you didn't know about us, but if you're our daddy, why didn't you know?" It was Gabrielle who answered, finally finding her voice as she walked around the counter and knelt beside her children. "Because Mama made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking with 4 years of regret. "Mama was scared and proud and foolish, and she didn't tell your father about you when she should have." Julian considered this for a long moment, then looked directly at Raphael. "Are you going to stay this time?" The question hit harder than any accusation could have. This 4-year-old boy was asking for the kind of promise that would define the rest of all their lives. Raphael reached out and gently touched his son's face, seeing himself in those serious features. "Yes," he said with absolute conviction. "I'm never leaving again. I promise you that, all of you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." And then, in front of 20 strangers in a chocolate cafe in Portland, Oregon, a family that had been separated by fear and pride and misunderstanding finally found each other again. The resolution didn't happen all at once, of course. There were legal papers to sign, custody arrangements to figure out, 4 years of separation to bridge. There were long conversations about trust and forgiveness, about the choices they'd both made and the pain they'd both carried. But 1 year later, on a perfect October afternoon, Sweet Solace's garden was transformed into the most beautiful wedding venue Portland had ever seen. Gabrielle walked down an aisle scattered with rose petals, wearing a dress the color of champagne and carrying a bouquet of lavender and baby's breath that smelled like her grandmother's garden in Provence. Celeste was her maid of honor, serious about her duties and making sure everyone knew exactly where they were supposed to stand. Raphael waited at the altar they'd set up beneath the old oak tree, wearing a suit that couldn't hide his joy, with Julian as his best man and Leo as the ring bearer who'd practiced for weeks to make sure he didn't drop the precious cargo. Little Sophia was the flower girl, though she'd insisted on carrying her favorite stuffed bunny along with the flower basket because Bunny wants to see Mama and Papa get married too. As they exchanged vows they'd written for each other, promising to choose trust over fear and love over pride for the rest of their lives, for small witnesses cheered loudly enough to be heard 3 blocks away. And in the chocolate display case inside Sweet Solace, right next to the lavender honey truffles that had brought them together, sat a new creation, Second Chances. Dark chocolate filled with salted caramel and gold leaf, sweet and complex and absolutely worth waiting for. Just like their love story. The truth is, we all make mistakes. We all let pride and fear make our decisions sometimes. We all have moments when we run away from the very thing that could make us happiest. But this story isn't really about the mistakes Gabrielle and Raphael made. It's about the fact that love, real love, doesn't give up. It doesn't stop caring just because someone disappears. It doesn't stop protecting just because the protection isn't acknowledged. Real love persists through misunderstandings and separations and years of silence. Real love finds a way to bridge any gap, heal any wound, and create something beautiful from even the most impossible circumstances. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, real love gets a second chance. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in second chances and the kind of love that never gives up. Because in a world that often tells us to protect ourselves first, stories like this remind us that the greatest protection of all is the courage to love completely, even when it's scary, even when it's risky, even when it might break our hearts. That courage, that willingness to be vulnerable for the sake of something greater than ourselves, is what transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary love stories. And sometimes, just sometimes, it leads to a chocolate cafe full of laughter, for children who know they're loved, and two people who finally understand that the best things in life are worth fighting for. That's the end of our story, but it's really just the beginning of theirs. A beginning built on truth instead of secrets, trust instead of fear, and the kind of love that can survive anything as long as both people are willing to choose each other, again and again, every single day. Because that's what real love does. It chooses. It stays. It builds something beautiful from whatever circumstances it's given. And it never, ever gives up.